Have you ever approached the altar to receive the body of Christ, while a quiet voice inside warned you weren't truly ready? That unsettling feeling might be more significant than you realize. According to Padre Pio, receiving the Eucharist while carrying unconfessed sins is among the most grave errors a faithful Catholic can commit, a spiritual misstep with consequences that extend far beyond the moment of communion. The saint who bore the wounds of Christ and could peer into souls warned us repeatedly about this profound spiritual danger. Yet many continue to approach the altar unprepared, unaware of the spiritual harm they inflict upon themselves. What you're about to discover is a transformative teaching from one of the Church's most mystically gifted saints, a revelation about preparation for Holy Communion that Padre Pio insisted was essential for true spiritual growth. This isn't merely about following rules, it's about protecting your soul from the damage that occurs when we receive the Lord unworthily. Through his extraordinary gift of reading hearts, Padre Pio identified specific sins that require confession before communion, sins many Catholics overlook or consider too minor to confess. But as you'll learn, in the spiritual realm, what seems insignificant to us may create profound spiritual barriers between our souls and Christ's transformative presence. Before revealing this list of 12 sins that Padre Pio warned must be confessed prior to receiving the Eucharist, you must understand something crucial about these teachings. These aren't arbitrary rules designed to burden you with guilt, but rather a spiritual prescription from a saint who saw, with supernatural clarity, the actual effects of unworthy communion on the human soul. Padre Pio described seeing souls that appeared luminous after worthy communion, while those who received unworthily emerged spiritually darkened. The Eucharist, he would say, is either the greatest medicine or the most dangerous poison, depending on the state of your soul. Are you prepared to examine your conscience with the same penetrating honesty this great saint brought to spiritual direction? Your spiritual life functions much like your physical health. Small issues left unaddressed eventually become serious conditions. Padre Pio explained that when we ignore these minor sins, they create a spiritual film over our souls, gradually reducing our sensitivity to God's presence and making it easier to commit more serious transgressions. This spiritual numbness is precisely what makes these sins so dangerous, not their individual gravity, but how they collectively diminish our spiritual receptivity. Consider how easily we justify small dishonesty, moments of deliberate disrespect, or habitual negativity toward others, rarely connecting these behaviors to our worthiness for communion. The Eucharist represents the most intimate possible union between your soul and Christ, a sacred encounter demanding the purest vessel you can offer. When Padre Pio counseled penitents, he would often stop them mid-confession, revealing sins they had forgotten or deliberately omitted, particularly these 12 categories that he saw repeatedly compromising souls. His supernatural insight allowed him to witness what happens spiritually during communion, how grace either floods through a properly prepared soul or meets resistance in one harboring unconfessed sin. When you approach the altar, he would warn, heaven observes with either great joy or profound sorrow. There is no neutral encounter with the living Christ. The protection of your soul depends on your willingness to confront these specific areas that Padre Pio identified as particularly problematic before communion. Too many faithful Catholics have grown comfortable with a superficial examination of conscience, addressing only the most obvious transgressions while allowing these 12 areas to remain unchecked, creating spiritual blockages that prevent the full flowering of Eucharistic grace. Each time you receive communion in this state, the opportunity for profound transformation is diminished, replaced instead with spiritual stagnation or even regression. This cycle continues until we have the courage to look deeper, to confess what we've normalized, and to approach the altar with genuine purity of heart. Padre Pio's teachings on worthiness for communion aren't meant to keep you from the sacrament, but to ensure you receive its full benefits. Like a spiritual physician, he prescribed frequent confession as the necessary preparation for communion, because he witnessed firsthand how transformed souls became when they followed this discipline. Countless spiritual testimonies from those who followed his guidance report experiencing the Eucharist in entirely new ways, describing profound peace, spiritual clarity, and tangible grace flowing into areas of their lives that had previously seemed impervious to change. These weren't just emotional experiences, but genuine spiritual transformations that reshaped relationships, conquered addictions, and renewed minds that had been trapped in negative thinking patterns. Your relationship with the Eucharist reflects your relationship with Christ himself. It requires honesty, vulnerability, and the courage to address what stands between you and complete union with him. Padre Pio often told his spiritual children, "The confessional is where you remove the obstacles. The altar is where you receive the prize." This sequential approach, confession first, communion second, was non-negotiable in his spiritual direction. He could see that when people reversed this order or skipped confession altogether, they not only failed to benefit from communion, but actually compounded their spiritual problems. The 12 sins you're about to discover represent the most common barriers Padre Pio identified, the precise areas where modern Catholics typically fail to prepare properly for the Eucharist. If you believe this teaching from Padre Pio can transform your spiritual life, as it has for thousands of devoted followers, write in the comments now, "I am ready for this blessing." Take this moment to commit yourself to a more authentic Eucharistic practice, one that begins with thorough confession, addressing these 12 specific areas. The grace you've been seeking, the spiritual breakthrough that seems elusive, the deeper communion with Christ you desire, all may be waiting for you on the other side of proper preparation for the Eucharist. Don't allow another day to pass receiving Christ unworthily, when the path to transformative communion lies directly before you. The first category of sins Padre Pio insisted must be confessed involves our intentional disregard for prayer and spiritual duties. When you consistently choose entertainment, social media scrolling, or other distractions over your committed prayer time, you're making a statement about your priorities that contradicts your physical gesture of receiving communion. Many Catholics fail to recognize that repeatedly, neglecting prayer isn't merely a lapse in discipline, but a form of spiritual sloth that requires confession. Padre Pio compared this to inviting an honored guest to your home while making no preparations for their arrival, a profound disrespect hidden behind casual excuses. Your spiritual muscles atrophy when not exercised regularly through prayer, making your soul increasingly unreceptive to Eucharistic grace. Padre Pio explained that this neglect creates a paradoxical situation. The very people who most need communion strength become the least able to receive it effectively due to their unprepared interior state. He would tell his spiritual children, "The soul that doesn't pray is like a barren field that produces no fruit, no matter how much rain falls upon it." The consistent neglect of prayer creates a spiritual callousness that, while not always recognized as sinful, nevertheless requires acknowledgement and confession before approaching the altar. The second category encompasses disrespect towards sacred things, casual attitudes about religious objects, irreverent behavior in church, and thoughtless reception of sacraments. Padre Pio was particularly grieved by how Catholics would receive communion mechanically, without preparation or thanksgiving, rushing from the church immediately afterward as if completing an errand rather than experiencing the most profound union possible with Christ. 10 minutes of thanksgiving after communion, he would insist, are absolutely necessary. Anything less is spiritual theft, stealing time that rightfully belongs to Jesus. This casual approach to sacred realities, while rarely confessed, was something Padre Pio considered essential to address before worthy communion. The third area requiring confession involves the subtle sins of the tongue, gossip, unnecessary criticism, and harsh judgments that we typically justify rather than confess. Padre Pio saw a direct connection between how we speak about others and our worthiness to receive Christ, who identified himself completely with every person. "When you wound another with your words," he would say, "you wound Christ himself, and then dare to receive him with the same tongue." This sin often remains unconfessed because we've normalized it, considering it harmless conversation rather than the character assassination it truly represents. Yet Padre Pio insisted that even what seems like innocent discussion of others' faults requires confession before communion. Your digital communications represent an extension of your tongue, and Padre Pio would undoubtedly include social media criticism, angry text messages, and email conflicts in this category, requiring confession. What makes these sins particularly insidious is how quickly they spread. A harsh word shared with one person potentially reaches dozens or hundreds, creating ripples of negativity that continue long after the initial communication. Padre Pio could supernaturally perceive these ripple effects and warned that we remain spiritually responsible for all the consequences of our words, even those that extend far beyond our awareness. Before receiving communion, we must reconcile not just with God, but with those we've harmed through careless or deliberately hurtful communication. The fourth category encompasses the hidden sins of envy and jealousy, interior attitudes that poison our relationships and spiritual life, while often remaining completely unconfessed. Padre Pio could see how these emotions created dark spheres of energy around otherwise devout Catholics, blocking the radiance of Eucharistic grace from fully penetrating their souls. Envy, he would explain, is like acid that corrodes your spiritual receptivity. You cannot simultaneously resent another's blessings and properly receive the Blessed Sacrament. These interior attitudes, while invisible to others, were completely transparent to the saint, who insisted they be acknowledged and confessed before approaching the altar. The fifth area involves our failures in family duties, the impatience, emotional absence, and neglect of responsibilities toward those closest to us. Padre Pio recognized that many Catholics who appeared devout in church were living contradictions at home, receiving communion regularly while failing to reflect Christ's love to their spouses, children, or parents. The first altar at which you must serve, he would counsel, is your family table. This disconnect between sacramental participation and family behavior represented a serious inconsistency that Padre Pio insisted must be addressed in confession. He particularly emphasized confessing habitual irritability with family members, something many consider too minor to mention, yet which creates an atmosphere contradicting the communion we claim to seek. Your intimate relationships reveal the true state of your soul more accurately than your public religious observance, and Padre Pio could perceive when reception of communion wasn't translating into transformed family dynamics. He would sometimes refuse communion to individuals who hadn't addressed these disconnects, explaining that receiving the sacrament while persisting in unchristlike behavior at home only increased their spiritual danger. Christ enters your home through your heart, he would say. If your heart remains closed to those you live with, how can it truly be open to him in the Eucharist? This challenging teaching calls us to examine not just religious obligations, but the quality of presence and love we bring to our closest relationships. The sixth category encompasses violations of justice in our work and financial dealings, taking shortcuts, performing work half-heartedly, wasting time when being paid, and small dishonest practices we typically rationalize. Padre Pio saw these minor economic infractions as serious breaches requiring confession, particularly when they had become habitual. He would explain that while individual instances might seem insignificant, the pattern reflected a fundamental misalignment with Christ's integrity. You cannot serve both God and money, he would remind penitents, and this choice happens not just in major decisions, but in these small daily compromises you've stopped questioning. Before receiving communion, he insisted these matters of justice needed rectification through both confession and concrete steps toward restitution. The seventh area requiring confession involves our misuse of God's creation, wastefulness, environmental disregard, and treating animals cruelly or indifferently. While this may seem surprising to modern Catholics, Padre Pio possessed profound reverence for all creation and considered humans spiritually accountable for their stewardship. All creation groans, he would explain, quoting scripture, waiting for the sons of God to be revealed. How can you receive the Creator while carelessly abusing his creation? He particularly emphasized confessing deliberate wastefulness, seeing it as ingratitude toward God's providence. This expanded understanding of ecological responsibility as a spiritual obligation offers prophetic insight for contemporary Catholics approaching communion. Your relationship with material possessions reveals much about your interior readiness for communion, and Padre Pio insisted that excessive consumption and materialistic preoccupation required confession before receiving the Eucharist. He saw how these attachments created spiritual interference that prevented Eucharistic grace from penetrating deeply. The soul preoccupied with acquiring and maintaining possessions, he explained, has little room left for Christ to enter and transform. This teaching challenges our modern consumer mentality, suggesting that our shopping habits and material priorities may require spiritual examination and confession more often than we realize. Before approaching the altar, Padre Pio would counsel examination of what truly occupies our hearts, Christ or our possessions. The eighth category encompasses failures in the thought life, deliberately entertaining impure thoughts, indulging in mental criticism or revenge fantasies, and allowing the mind to dwell on negative scenarios. Padre Pio emphasized that interior purity was essential for worthy communion, not just external behavior. Your thoughts shape your soul, he would explain, creating either fertile or toxic soil for the Eucharistic seed. What makes this area particularly challenging is our tendency to dismiss thoughts as inconsequential compared to actions. Yet Padre Pio insisted that habitual negative thought patterns required confession and spiritual direction. He developed specific practices to help penitents achieve greater mental discipline in preparation for receiving communion worthily. The ninth area requiring confession involves what Padre Pio called sins of omission, opportunities to do good that we consciously avoid, acts of charity we neglect, and spiritual promptings we ignore. While these don't typically make our examination of conscience, Padre Pio considered them serious obstacles to Eucharistic grace. The hands that reach out to receive Christ, he would say, must be the same hands that have reached out to serve him in others. This profound connection between communion and active charity challenges the compartmentalized faith that separates sacramental participation from social responsibility. Before communion, Padre Pio insisted we confess not just the wrong we've done, but the good we've failed to do. Your interactions with the marginalized, the poor, elderly, sick, and socially excluded were especially emphasized by Padre Pio as directly connected to worthy communion. He could supernaturally perceive when communicants had repeatedly passed by human need without response, creating what he described as a veil of indifference that prevented full Eucharistic receptivity. When you ignore Christ in the distressing disguise of the poor, he would explain, you diminish your capacity to recognize him in the Eucharist. This teaching reminds us that preparation for communion extends beyond personal piety to encompass our active engagement with human suffering and need, with failures in this area requiring specific confession. The 10th category encompasses ingratitude and complaint, habitual negativity, focusing on problems rather than blessings, and failing to thank God regularly. Padre Pio saw these attitudes as particularly offensive, given the gratitude that should characterize those preparing to receive the Eucharist, which means thanksgiving. The ungrateful heart, he would explain, is like a sealed container that cannot receive the water of grace, no matter how abundantly it's poured. He insisted that patterns of complaint and negativity required specific confession, particularly before receiving communion. This teaching challenges our cultural tendency toward criticism and dissatisfaction, suggesting that our basic orientation toward life, grateful or complaining, has profound spiritual implications. The 11th area requiring confession involves our relationship with time, procrastination, wasting the precious hours God has given, and failing to order our days with spiritual purpose. Padre Pio viewed time as a sacred gift requiring stewardship and accountability. Each minute is a priceless opportunity to love God and neighbor, he would counsel, and deliberate waste of time is waste of grace. He particularly emphasized confessing media habits and entertainment choices that consistently displaced prayer, service, and relationships. Before receiving communion, Padre Pio insisted we examine how we've spent the hours since our last confession, acknowledging patterns that reflect disordered priorities. Your use of modern technology would certainly concern Padre Pio today, particularly when digital distraction prevents presence to God and others. While he couldn't have anticipated smartphones, his spiritual principles applied directly to our screen habits and constant connectivity. The devil's greatest deception, he once said, is convincing souls they're too busy for God. This insight speaks powerfully to our technology-saturated culture, suggesting that our digital habits may require more regular examination and confession than we realize. Before communion, Padre Pio would undoubtedly counsel us to confess the ways technology has displaced spiritual attentiveness and genuine human connection. The 12th and final area Padre Pio emphasized involves spiritual presumption, approaching the Eucharist casually, without proper preparation or thanksgiving, assuming God's grace while making minimal effort at interior disposition. This presumption manifests as routine reception of communion without the corresponding commitment to ongoing conversion. The greatest tragedy, Padre Pio would say, is not those who stay away from communion because they know they're unprepared, but those who receive unworthily without discernment. Before receiving the Eucharist, he insisted we confess this casual attitude itself, the presumption that we can approach the sacred mysteries without the reverence and preparation they deserve. Don't wait another day to implement these teachings. Tonight, before you sleep, examine your conscience in light of these 12 areas Padre Pio identified. Schedule confession this week, addressing these specific aspects with new awareness. Then, when you next receive communion, experience the profound difference proper preparation makes. The spiritual clarity, interior peace, and transformative grace that flow when obstacles are removed. The Eucharist awaits not just as a ritual, but as the living encounter with Christ it's meant to be.